everyone, and welcome to the third lesson of the course. So this video is actually split up into two parts. The first one being about the rule of thirds, which we talked about in a prior lesson, and the second part being about depth of field, which we also touched on in another video. So the composition aspect I want to cover today is the rule of thirds, which is one of the basic framing tools that, once understood, can drastically improve your own pictures and videos. And what we're doing with this concept is breaking the image down into both horizontal and vertical thirds, which leaves us with 9 equal parts of the frame. And these 9 parts will give you 4 intersecting points where you should place the most important points of interest in your scene. There have been studies that show that the eyes tend to be drawn more naturally to these intersecting points rather than to the center of the frame. And so the idea with this concept is that it will make your shots more balanced, giving the viewer the ability to interact more naturally with the scene. So since you already have the rule of thirds grid set up on your iPhone, which I showed you how to do in the previous lesson, you need to consider that when capturing a subject, you typically want to place it in one of the 4 intersecting points. For close-up shots of people, placing the eye of your subject at one of these intersecting points is a very effective means of using the grid. But for wider shots, placing the head at one of these intersecting points will probably end up working better for you. However, keep in mind the negative space and place your subject in a section that makes sense. For example, with a person, placing the subject at the top third makes more sense so that you won't have a distracting amount of headroom above the subject. Now, if the subject you're capturing isn't a person, then this leaves you with a lot more room to experiment with which element to place in the various intersecting points of the frame. And another way to use this rule of thirds is with landscape shots. The idea of placing the horizon on either the top third or bottom third of your shot is a way to improve a landscape scene so that it won't be too boring. Basically, you're deciding if the ground is the more interesting element or the sky. And if the ground is more interesting, then you want to place the horizon in the top third. On the other hand, if the sky is more interesting, then you want to place it on the bottom third in order to display that. And then you can start to think about combining these elements of placing the horizon on one of these thirds as well as using the intersecting points to bring out a subject, which will then create an even more dynamic scene. And if you have multiple points of interest, see how you can frame that scene in order to put those points of interest at the various intersecting points of your frame. And instead of the rule of thirds, it might be better to think of it as a concept of thirds because there really aren't any rules. These are just techniques that are known to make your shots more interesting. Now for the second part of our lesson, depth of field. So depth of field is basically just the area that's in focus in front of and behind the subject that you're trying to focus your camera on. And the depth of field is actually controlled by your aperture. Now, this is where some people get confused, but you don't have to. I'll give you an easy way to think about this. So a smaller f-stop number actually corresponds to a larger aperture hole. And that larger aperture hole doesn't get too many things in focus, so it creates a smaller depth of field. However, when you increase that f-stop number, you make the aperture hole smaller, and that aperture hole can make more things in focus, creating a larger depth of field. So all you need to think of it as, the smaller the f-stop number creates a small depth of field, and the large f-stop number creates a large depth of field. So this is a very small or shallow depth of field. And this one is a large depth of field, where much closer is still in focus and way into the distance is still sharp as well. So typically for a portrait photo, when there's only one thing you're supposed to be looking at, which is your subject, you want everything else to be out of focus. So to make your subject stand out against the background, you use a small depth of field for that blurry background effect. But contrast to that, in a landscape photo, you actually want a big depth of field. Because the close-up plants and flowers and distant mountains and clouds, everything is interesting, and you want the viewer's eye to be able to travel everywhere in the scene. So for a landscape photo, you want a big depth of field. As we've seen in these images, using a bigger or smaller depth of field to affect the background actually has a pretty significant impact on the photo. Here's a shot of a zebra using a fairly large depth of field. So the zebra and the background together all feel quite flat and stuck together, as opposed to using a smaller depth of field, where you can see the beautiful blurry background, the zebra just leaps out against it, and you can even see the individual hair details on the mane. So to adjust the depth of field on the iPhone is actually really straightforward, and I'm going to show you how to do it now. To have more control over the look of your photos, one of the things you really get a grip on is the lock focus mode in your Apple camera. If you want the camera to see something the way you're seeing it, then you need to lock for focus on the part of the image you want to get sharp. Now, the Apple camera won't always do this for you. So to learn this aspect of it is really important, and I'll show you how to do this using the scene we've got behind me with all these trees. So if I point my camera to these flowers now, the autofocus is automatically focusing on the scene in the background. However, what we want is the flowers to be in focus. So what we need to do is go a little closer and click on there. So after we've clicked, now the flowers have sprung into life, the background's gone nice and blurred, and here we have a shallow depth of field because the subject is in focus and it's closer to the camera. However, after I take the picture, what happens is the focus just went back into the background. Now we've got the flowers once again out of focus. To avoid this, we can lock the camera's focus onto the flowers by simply tapping and holding instead of clicking. The auto exposure autofocus lock comes on, and now we've got our beautiful flowers once again in focus. We could take that picture again and the flowers would still be in focus and the autofocus doesn't reset. A simple technique, a really easy one, but it can make a huge impact on your photography. Well, that's it for today's lesson. We actually covered quite a bit of content today. We covered the rule of thirds, depth of field, and even how to control depth of field on your iPhone camera. As always, I encourage you to go outside, even to your garden, and apply what you've learned today. I actually combined these two concepts in the flower photo, and if you look back on it, I combined the rule of thirds using my grid and depth of field to create the flower image. As always, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I'll see you next time. Have a great day.